voicemail from my brother was 3 seconds long. Just his voice, flat and strange, saying, "We need to talk about the house. Don't come by today." I stood in the parking lot of the hospital where I work, still in my scrubs, staring at my phone like it had said something in a language I didn't quite speak. I'd just finished a 12-hour shift. My feet hurt. I had a half-eaten granola bar in my pocket and exactly zero mental bandwidth for whatever "we need to talk about the house" meant. I called him back. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. "My name is Joss Merritt. I'm 31 years old, a pediatric nurse, and until about 4 months ago, I thought my family was normal. Annoying sometimes, a little chaotic at the holidays, but normal. My dad passed away 2 years ago from a heart attack that none of us saw coming. He was 62. He was healthy. He was laughing at a football game one Sunday afternoon, and then he wasn't. My mom took it hard. We all did. But she took it in that quiet, going through motions way that scared me more than crying would have. My brother stepped in. He said he'd handle things. He said he'd take care of her. I believed him. That was my first mistake. The house my dad left behind was a 3-bedroom ranch in Asheville, North Carolina. He paid it off 12 years before he died. No mortgage, no liens, nothing. Just a house sitting clean and clear in his name. His will split everything equally between my brother and me, with a life estate for my mom, meaning she could live there for the rest of her life. Simple. Clean. The way my dad did everything. My brother's name is Derek. He's 6 years older than me, married to a woman I'll call his wife, because I don't trust myself to use her name right now without my blood pressure spiking. She's the kind of person who says things like, "We're family," while her eyes calculate. She's always been kind in a way that felt like a performance. I smiled and ignored it because Derek seemed happy and I loved my brother. I drove to my mom's house the morning after the voicemail. Derek hadn't answered any of my calls, but my mom had, briefly, her voice small in a way that made me push the speed limit the whole way there. When I pulled up, there was a white sedan in the driveway I didn't recognize. I knocked. My mom answered, and the look on her face, not relief exactly, more like someone who'd been treading water alone in a dark room and finally heard a door open. There were papers on the kitchen table. I didn't understand what I was looking at right away. I picked them up. I read the words. I read them again. A deed transfer. Dated 6 weeks ago. My mother's name, my father's estate, transferred into a joint ownership between Derek and his wife. My name was nowhere on it. My mother said she thought she was signing something for the life estate documentation. She said Derek brought papers over on a Sunday, told her it was routine, told her the lawyer had explained it all to him and he was just relaying the information. She said he was in a hurry. She signed where he pointed. I set the papers down carefully. I picked up my coffee mug from the counter. I took a slow sip even though it had gone cold. Then I looked at my mom and said, "Where's Derek right now?" She said she didn't know. He hadn't been by since that morning. That was the moment. Not of panic, not of rage, but of something clicking off inside me. Something that knew the situation for exactly what it was and went very, very still. I took photos of every page before I left. Then I drove home and I called my lawyer. Here's the thing people don't understand about betrayal inside a family. It doesn't arrive like a bomb. It seeps in slowly like water under a door, and by the time you feel it on your feet, the floor is already warped. Looking back, I can trace every moment I should have known. I chose not to see it because Derek was my brother, and when you love someone, you grant them the benefit of the doubt right up until you can't anymore. It started the spring after my dad died. Derek volunteered to handle the estate administration. I was grateful. I was neck deep in my nursing program at the time, working 2 jobs, barely sleeping. He said he knew a lawyer. He said he'd keep me in the loop. He kept me in the loop, the way people do when they're hoping you'll stop asking questions. Vague updates. It's in process. The probate is taking a while. The court dates keep getting pushed. I nodded. I trusted. I moved across the state for a job I loved, and I let my brother handle the thing I should have been handling myself. His wife started coming around to my mom's more, always with a casserole, always with a reason to stay a few hours. My mom said she enjoyed the company. She'd been lonely. I felt relieved, if I'm honest. I couldn't be there as often as I wanted. I was working weekends. I was tired. I told myself I was lucky to have a sister-in-law who picked up the slack. I'm cringing at my own naivety writing this now. Then came the comments. The first time I noticed them, I dismissed it as nothing. We were at Easter dinner and my mom's, Derek's wife, cut in the ham like she owned the kitchen and she said, almost to the air, "This house is really a lot for one person to maintain, isn't it? All these repairs." My mom smiled uncertainly. I changed the subject. The next time was July. My mom mentioned, almost in passing, that Derek had suggested maybe she'd be more comfortable in one of those independent living communities. Somewhere with activities, she wouldn't be so isolated. My mom was 64, she gardened. She had friends. She was not ready for a retirement community. When I asked her if she wanted to move, she said, no, of course not. She just didn't want to make things hard for anyone. I called Derek. He said I was overreacting. He said he was just thinking about mom's future. He said I wasn't around enough to understand the situation. Maybe that one landed because I already felt guilty about the distance. I let it go. But then the mail situation started. My mom mentioned she hadn't received a property tax statement. I looked into it and found the address for correspondence on the county assessor's website had been changed, updated 3 months prior, to Derek's address. When I brought it up, Derek said he'd done it to help manage the paperwork. He said mom forgot things sometimes and he was just streamlining. He said I was making a big deal out of nothing. I started paying closer attention after that. I requested a copy of my father's probate records from the county courthouse. It took me a few weeks to get through the paperwork, but when I sat down with everything, I understood. The estate had been closed. The life estate had been closed. The life estate had been documented, but in the fine print of one amended filing, something that required a beneficiary's signature to finalize, my signature appeared. My signature, which I had never provided. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed and ran back through every phone call, every vague update, every time Derek said, "It's handled," and I said, okay. Then I thought about the papers my mom had signed, thinking they were routine. Then I thought about the deed transfer I'd photographed that morning. And I understood. This wasn't just one careless decision. This was a plan. I didn't call Derek. I didn't say a word to his wife. I went to my attorney, my own attorney, not the one Derek had used. And I laid everything out. The forged signature in the probate documents. The deed transfer my mom had signed under false pretenses. The changed mailing address. All of it. My attorney looked at everything carefully and then looked at me and said, "Jas, this is fraud." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you ready to file?" I looked at the folder in my lap which had my father's name on the estate papers, and I thought about him sitting in his recliner, a man who worked 40 years to own something outright, who thought he'd protected us. I said, "Yes, file everything." The next 4 weeks were the hardest kind of patience I've ever practiced. I went back to my regular life. I worked my shifts. I called my mom and talked about her garden and what was blooming and what the deer had gotten into. I said nothing about what was happening behind the scenes. Meanwhile, my attorney moved fast. She filed a complaint with the North Carolina Secretary of State's office for the fraudulent deed transfer. She contacted the county clerk regarding the forged signature in the probate documents. She reached out to an estate fraud specialist who reviewed everything and confirmed what we already knew. The deed transfer was invalid because my mother had signed under false representation of what the document was. And because the change required consent from both beneficiaries, me, which was never obtained. Legally, the whole thing was a house of cards. My brother didn't know any of this. He was still texting me occasionally, the way people do when they're performing normalcy, asking if I was coming home for Thanksgiving, mentioning mom's car needed its oil changed. I responded in short sentences. Fine, maybe. Thanks for letting me know. Gave him nothing. His wife texted me once, a long message about family unity and how important it was that we all worked together during this time. I read it twice, then set my phone face down on the counter and went back to my book. The Friday before everything came to a head, my attorney called me with an update. The court had accepted our emergency motion to freeze any further transfer or sale of the property pending investigation. The sheriff's office had been notified. The next step was serving Derek. She asked me where I'd be the following morning. I told her I'd be at my mom's house. She said good. I got there early. I made coffee. My mom and I sat at the kitchen table the way we used to when I was a kid, before my dad got sick and the world rearranged itself, before I understood that grief makes people into strangers sometimes, even people you've known your whole life. She asked me how work was going. I told her about a little girl I'd had as a patient that week, 5 years old, obsessed with dolphins, who had drawn me a picture of a dolphin riding a bicycle because I'd mentioned I didn't know how to ride one as a joke. We laughed. My mom looked like herself. It was the most ordinary moment I'd had in months. Then there was a knock at the door. It was my brother and his wife. She had a tote bag over one arm like she was staying for brunch. My brother looked tired. That particular tiredness that lives behind the eyes when someone has been working hard at something they know is wrong. His wife breezed past me into the kitchen. She said good morning to my mom, set her bag down and started talking about the property taxes needing to be sorted before the end of the year, and wasn't it so much easier now that everything was simplified. Her word, simplified. My brother stood near the door, hands in his pockets, not quite meeting my eyes. I sat back down at the table with my coffee. My mom looked between us, uncertain. Then there was another knock at the door. Derek answered it. I watched his face. A sheriff's deputy stood on the porch with papers in hand, professional, polite. He asked for Derek's full name. He asked for his wife's name. Then he said the words I'd been waiting 4 weeks to hear. You're being served. Fraudulent deed transfer. Forgery of a beneficiary's signature in a probate proceeding. You'll need to appear. His wife's tote bag fell off her arm. She said something, I don't remember exactly, something starting with, "This is completely," and then stopping. My brother said my name, just my name, the way he used to when we were kids, and he'd broken something and needed me to not tell. I looked at him steadily and said nothing. She recovered first, the way people do when they're practiced at control. She straightened up and said this was clearly a misunderstanding, that she had documentation, that anyone could see the intent was to help our mother, that I was the one making things complicated when everything had been handled appropriately and in the family's best interests. I said, "Whose family?" She stopped. My mom behind me put her hand on my shoulder. Derek looked at the floor. He said, "Joss, I never wanted it to go like this." I said, "Derek, you forged my name. You tricked Mom into signing a document she didn't understand. You changed the mailing address on the property so I wouldn't get notifications. You did all of this to get a house that belongs to both of us." I paused. "How exactly did you want it to go?" He didn't answer. There wasn't an answer to give. The deputy completed the service. They were both escorted to a vehicle outside. My mom and I stood in the kitchen together, listening to the sound of doors and tires on gravel, and then it was quiet. My mom started to cry, the kind of crying that comes from exhaustion more than anything else. I held her for a long time. I didn't say it was okay because some things aren't okay. I just held on. 6 weeks later, I sat in a courtroom in Nashville across from my brother and his wife and their attorney. Our attorney had prepared a case that left very little room for interpretation. She had the deed transfer with my mother's signature obtained under false pretense. She had the forged probate document with handwriting analysis confirming the signature was not mine. She had the county record showing the unauthorized mailing address change. She had phone records that placed several calls between Derek and the original estate attorney. Calls made without my knowledge to alter filings I was supposed to be consulted on. Their attorney argued my brother had acted in good faith, believed he had authority, had only been trying to protect his mother. The judge listened. Then the judge picked up our folder, looked through several pages, and set it down. He said the evidence was clear. The deed transfer was voided. The fraudulent probate document was referred to the state attorney's office for criminal review. The property reverted to the original terms of my father's will, equally owned by Derek and me, with our mother's life estate intact. Derek's accounts were ordered frozen, pending the fraud investigation. Any profit from a potential sale he had apparently already begun negotiating. Something I learned about in that courtroom for the first time was halted. He sat across from me and looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally put it down, except the thing had crushed something on the way. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I felt tired. I felt sad in a way that doesn't really have a clean name. He was my brother. He taught me to drive in an empty parking lot when I was 15. He sat with me in the hospital the night my dad died, and neither of us said a word for 3 hours, and it was enough. I don't know who made him think this was acceptable. Maybe the answer is simpler than I want it to be. Maybe greed doesn't need a complicated origin story. As we walked out of the courthouse, my mom looped her arm through mine. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your father would have been furious." I almost laughed. "Yeah, he also," she said carefully, "would have been very proud of how you handled it." I didn't say anything. The sunlight was warm on the steps outside. There were pigeons on the railing. Somewhere behind us, Derek and his wife were talking to their attorney in low voices. Their problem now, not mine. My phone buzzed. A message from my attorney. Final order signed. Property records updated. You're done. I stood on those courthouse steps with my mom beside me and breathed in a way I hadn't been able to for months. Clean, full, all the way down. My father spent 40 years building something he thought would hold, and I wasn't going to let it disappear on someone's Sunday afternoon while my mom signed papers she didn't understand. They thought I was too busy, too far away, too trusting. They were right about the last one for a while. Not anymore.